All right. We are now broadcasting to all attendees. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for
Hey,
a
dude.
panel discussion. Yes?
I gotta introduce you first.
Okay, no worries.
Give me just a second. Welcome everyone to week 2, day 2 of the Fair Foundation virtual conference series, Building a Culture of Preparedness. This is a very distinguished panel today and led by a very distinguished retired Army general who is on the Fair Foundation board. Retired Brigadier General Duke Deluca commanded 2 engineering divisions, Iraq and Afghanistan, and was a part of 4 river basin commissions, chaired 2 of them, is on the Coastal Engineering Research Board, and is really a brilliant guy. And we're here with also a brilliant panel to talk about flood risk management and changes that are on the horizon. Sir, it's your panel.
Thank you very much, Jay. Appreciate it. And thanks everybody for tuning in, whether you're tuning in now live or later with the recorded version, given your time constraints. Welcome. We have a great panel today with a breadth of state and local government, federal government, private sector, academic, and advocacy experience that are here to talk about the trends in flood management in the United States. It's a huge issue that only is increasing in its significance, and our vulnerability is only increasing with every passing year, both for developmental reasons and because of the changes in climate and their impacts. So it's a very timely topic. Jay said I was part of the Fair Foundation board. He recruited me because of my irritation. After 32 years in the Army, I had spent a great deal of time with excellent maps, some of them brought to you by one of our panelists here today. We've had the best and most detailed high-resolution maps in the history of human warfare in these most current wars. And these tools were available to me. And then when I returned to the United States after a long time in Afghanistan and Iraq, I found that I was being charged with taking care of threats and hazards in the homeland, to include flood threats inland and coastal. And I did not have the tools to properly identify the threat, model the threat, and understand it, and take the required steps necessary. And I was greatly peevish about this, and I fought a long time while in the Corps of Engineers, and then have been advocating since then through FAIR and other places for an improvement to the way that we do flood mapping, how we understand the flood threat, and how we respond to it with all the variety of tools that exist. And so that's the reason that I'm here with you today, even though I'm an Army general, or was an Army general. We have a great panel today. I'm going to introduce each of them before I ask them to give their remarks. There's 4 of them. I had a very scientific process of a pairwise comparison coin flip series to choose the order of speaker, because in the end, we can't go wrong however we do that. So the first up right now is going to be Dr. Sam Brody. Sam is joining us from Houston, Texas. He is the director for the Center for Texas Beaches and Shores. He's also a professor at Texas A&M University, has been since 2009. His PhD is in city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina, which is about 15 minutes from where I'm sitting here in Cary, North Carolina. And he has done a lot of academic work and research in this topic, and is part of a group, of course, that's working with government officials to understand and manage the flood hazards and keep people and property safe. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Sam. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Duke. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm flattered to be asked to speak on a panel that includes so many prestigious people. I want to talk about, I was asked to talk about what are the innovations we're working on, and I'm going to talk about very briefly the latest results we have for measuring, mapping, and communicating flood risk. So what I'm going to talk about is our particular work, but in the context of this is the future of understanding, locating, and communicating flood risk in the United States. And the work stems from our urban flood research, along with the great Jerry Galloway, who's a good mentor of mine. And we would start to look across the United States when trying to figure out what's going on with the increasing levels of urban flooding. And we would find lots of specific observed flood loss that is never closely captured by our hydraulic and hydrologic models. So it began a discussion on how can we do better and what is the problem. And what we found is that over time, and this trend is for Texas, but also holds true for the United States, is that the FEMA floodplain, the primary marker being used for risk and flood risk management in the United States, is drastically under capturing the actual impact, the risk and impact, particularly in developed and urban areas, because it's so difficult to do. So the H&H models, unless you spend millions of dollars and 10 years to these very granular, often academic-based HEC-RAS 2D models, spatially distributed models, it's very hard to capture the risk. And so that has implications for insurance, for household adjustments, for mitigation. And I was very critical with FEMA about, what's happening here. And they said, well, how about some solutions for once? And so in partnership with FEMA and the state of Texas, we're working on this new generation of approaches to figure out where, when, and how much at a parcel level flood impact we're going to expect. And it's taking a statistical approach, not an H&H approach, using artificial intelligence, machine learning models that have come on board very recently. We can very accurately, with a fraction of the cost, accounting for very specific local changes and features of the built environment, start to predict risk. Now, is this going to replace the FEMA floodplain maps? I'm supposed to say this, says FEMA. No, it's a complementary approach, but absolutely this is going to be the future, both from FEMA and everywhere else, how we're starting to map and measure these different layers of risk. And here's an example. We take, we go down to a small neighborhood. This is just on the northern part of Houston. We have all these ways of now measuring and mapping observed loss, whether it's a 311 call, a Waze report, a NFIP claim, an IA payout, local jurisdictional damage assessments. These are observational points, and there are millions of them. We can take that and using our machine, and I'm not going to talk about the specifics of machine learning, but I'm happy to do so offline. I don't want to put everyone to sleep. But from that, we can start to create these images, and these computers are literally learning, so they can account for very subtle changes in the built environment, like a building permit, and changes in impervious surface by the week. And we start to not only be able to map 100-year, but different gradients of risk. It's another thing FEMA is going to be moving towards in the future. And here I just put on the same area, the dark areas of the FEMA 100-year and 500-year maps. And you can see these areas are higher risk that aren't accounted for any of those maps. And we, we run these scenarios where we have the FEMA map, then we bring in the super duper H&H models from academics map, which does a lot better. And then we do our map, and you're talking about exponentially more accurate measurement, because we don't care where the water goes. And I know that's controversial. We care where the impact is. And so we can short circuit the physics of where the water flows and go right to the impact. And that's why it's so much more accurate, and it's scalable. And we use high performance computers, but we could do the entire state of Texas in 5 or 6 hours versus decades it's taking for Harris County to redo their floodplain maps via H&H. No matter what model we use, I don't think there's any substitute for talking to people. And so in this project that's supported by FEMA and Texas General Land Office, we go in with our maps, and this is a big team. I'm the talking head today. I'm supported by a lot of smarter people around me. And we say, we don't say, this is our map. What do you think? This is what we're doing. We're informing of our risk. We say, here's a map. We did the best we could with a model. Tell us why it's wrong, and draw on the map. And so, I just want to make the point that I know it's time consuming, it's hard, but we need to be talking to people who are impacted by these chronic flood events, because there's stuff that the best machine learning model, the best H&H model will never capture. It's a human experience. And I think that can be systematically baked into models to help us calibrate and improve them over time. It's somewhat messy, but right now it's working at a small scale in Texas. And so when we go back to the comparative drawing board, we see all these green dots or individual observed losses. Here's, this floodplain is one of the most chronically impacted areas in America for flooding, Ireland, Houston, Texas. And we gaze around, and it's not just a better model that's going to capture miles upstream. It's a different technique. And when we apply our own technique to these areas, we can see, this is way left out of a FEMA floodplain model. But then when we do our machine learning models, we get something like this. Local jurisdictions, some of the politicians, they don't like this because it shows more impact. And they're like, we don't want any more maps showing more potential risk in our jurisdiction. I'm like, well, people should know. In this box up here, people flooded 3 times in 3 years. And they should know. And other panelists are doing great work around this, including First Street Foundation. And it's part of this groundswell of how do we better communicate or measure and communicate risk. Because the machine learning models are so scalable and identifiable, it offers an opportunity to communicate these issues to a large audience. And so the last step is you can have the best model or best rendition in the world. If you can't communicate it in a way that's effective, usable, and interpretable to different audiences, it does no good. And FEMA's been really interested in talking to me about our experiences with this very startup unfunded service project we did a couple years ago called Buyers Beware, which was a way to try to connect a risk in a Zillow-like framework. What we're doing now is we're expanding that in Texas. So this is basically, it's all risk, but flooding is prominent. You put an address, you choose a parcel to give you a risk profile. And this map is that area that was way left out of the FEMA floodplain. And you can see from this score, the FEMA floodplain zone is a go, it's a green, but past flooding, the chronic flooding is a red. The only way you would know that is through this, unless you had a really savvy real estate agent, through a format like this. And so with these kind of visualization and communication tools, we're going to start to load up our machine learning innovations. Again, not as a replacement, but as a complementary communication tool. The state of Texas is going to embrace it in an official way, and we're going to be able to serve this and other data to better communicate risk at a parcel level through communication tools like this, and at the same time start to communicate to decision makers on how they can better prepare their communities on what to do about reducing the risk through mitigation. This tool also has individual mitigation tips and tricks based on the individual score that a parcel will get, what you can do to reduce your risk. So takeaways, I'll end there for discussion. And I know this is a bold statement, but I think everyone can agree it's really hard to use H&H models to predict flooding risk and impact, particularly in developed and urban areas that are changing rapidly. And that's not the only problem with the FEMA 100-year floodplain map, but one of the major problems. And partially it's because physics-based models are either really time-consuming or expensive, or are scaled in a way where they really can't get the granularity over large areas. The future, and like most things I do, I just scratch the surface and other people come in and push it forward, which I think is fine. I think you're going to see a lot of really smart people with this machine learning statistical approaches that have supercomputing centers attached to their organizations that are going to come in and start. I mean, we all know AI seems to be everywhere. Really change really innovate around this space. And it's attractive, even if it's a complementary tool, because it's scalable, it's much less expensive, it's much more accurate if our goal isn't to set insurance rates, but to predict and identify where risk and impact is going to occur. But we need to be able to visualize and communicate whatever we do and get human input, have our models informed by individuals at some level. I think that's really important. And I feel like at least in my world, fusing engineering with sociology, the built environment with hydraulics, we're there. That's acceptable. We're just figuring out ways to do it in a way that's going to make households and communities at large more resilient over the long term. So that's my talk, and I'm eager to have a discussion, and I know my colleagues on the rest of the panel are going to take these issues even further and more in depth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Sam. We'll hold questions to the end, and we'll move to our next speaker now. And that is going to be Mr. Michael Harper. He is a senior strategist now at Woolpert Incorporated. They are an architectural and engineering and geospatial information services company working in the private market. Prior to joining them in the private market, Mr. Harper was a warrant officer grade 5 in the Army, which is takes a long time to do. And for those who don't know, warrant officers in the Army are the technical experts in a variety of fields. In this case, it was geospatial information services for Mr. Harper. He also served a long time as a civilian after that at the Army Geospatial Center, where he was the director of warfighter support and production. And during a time when we have had 2 wars ongoing since 2001 and 2003, that was a very busy job in a large number of places around the world. And so he has a tremendous amount of experience with mapping and understanding hazards, modeling, and other things. And I'm going to turn over the floor to you, Mr. Harper. Thank you for joining us.
Sure. Thanks, General Deluca. Again, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's exciting to get to talk about this. So when General Deluca first asked me to do this, I wasn't part of Woolpert. I think he planned to do something like this last year at some point, and I was kind of a straight up Army civilian. And when he first started showing me some of the lack of data and things like that, I had some pretty strong opinions about it, like he did, and was so now that I work for Woolpert, I've had to temper those opinions a little bit. But just real quick, I just kind of wanted to, a little bit about my background. I'm not a flood mapping expert by any stretch. I was a geospatial guy in the Army for a long time. I was most recently a Department of the Army civilian, where I was the director of warfighter support at the Army Geospatial Center, where I ran several geospatial programs for the Army to include collecting high resolution imagery and LiDAR data over areas like Iraq and Afghanistan and other areas where we operated in. So I have a lot of experience with collection, exploitation, and dissemination of geospatial information. And then prior to my time as a Department of the Army civilian doing that, I was a warrant officer, like General Deluca said, where my primary mission was really to enable senior commanders to visualize and understand the impacts of terrain on military operations. So just real quick, just a little intro about Woolpert. So we contribute to, we work for a lot of the different federal agencies that are involved in flood mapping. So we work for NOAA, we work for USGS on the 3DEP program. We work for the Joint Airborne Bathymetric LiDAR Center of Excellence doing bathymetric LiDAR collections along our coastlines. Woolpert's been around since 1911, about 30 offices nationwide. We just recently went over 1,000 employees. Some of the stuff that we do is we invest heavily in technology, mostly in LiDAR sensors and electro-optical sensors that are involved in the collection of elevation data and imagery for federal agencies like USACE, NOAA, FEMA, USGS, big contributor to the 3DEP program, like I said. But we also do a lot of city, county, and state municipalities. So we collect about 1 million square kilometers annually. We just have gone up to about 14 aircraft now and just continually doing sensors. But what's kind of neat is we're not really a fly-by-night geospatial firm. We've been around for 108 years doing this stuff. So obviously not LiDAR for that long. But when kind of like General Deluca mentioned is, you know, when I started looking at this, not to compare it directly to Iraq and Afghanistan, but, you know, when you look at some of the challenges that we had in the Army with acquiring high resolution data, maintaining currency of foundation data, and then raising awareness about those issues and modernizing our processes and our analytics, there's a lot of similarities between kind of this community of practice and what we were doing in the Army. And so not exactly the same, but if you look at when we went into Iraq in 2003, we had owned the airspace over Iraq for about 12 years. You know, we dominated the airspace in Southern Watch and Northern Watch. We flew over it daily, but yet we failed to map it at a tactical scale, or a scale that was of a good enough resolution to actually launch a campaign like we did in 2003. So when we went into Iraq in 2003, we had 30-meter elevation data based on a bare earth model. So a measurement every 100 feet. So very low-grade elevation data. And then we sent soldiers into complex and urban terrain environments with 20 to 25-year-old city graphics. And so when I first kind of started looking at, so we had to rebuild our capability. We had divested all of our mapping capability. We had divested our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities out of the Army. So we had to go on this campaign of educating senior leaders about, one, that this was a problem, and then how we could go about fixing it. And part of that is we had to rebuild those capabilities. And then we had to completely change the way we did analysis, because our analysis now had to be at a much higher resolution because of the precision operations that we were conducting and the urban and complex terrain environments that we were operating in. So we had to completely take advantage of IT. We had to take advantage of our networks, move data closer to the fight, and actually change our analysis to kind of respond to the speed of operations. So when you look at all of that, there's just a lot of similarities. It wasn't until the mid-2000s that I started looking at the United States and looking at our, you know, most of my focus was overseas in contingency areas. I started looking at the United States and I started looking at, I couldn't believe that we didn't have 1 meter elevation data over the continental United States. It was absolutely crazy to me. It was mind-boggling. And then I couldn't believe that Alaska still wasn't mapped, you know, in mid-2000s, and it still wasn't mapped at a useful scale. So there are a lot of similarities, and you know, we went on a huge campaign to raise awareness about why we needed this kind of high resolution data and how it helped soldiers and saved lives. And I would submit that, you know, this community of practice could benefit from a serious awareness campaign as well. Kind of like Sam was talking about, is that we have to raise awareness that there's there's kind of a different way of doing this. But this whole kind of community kind of begs for automation and an insertion of new technology. I think there's a lot of things that are coming that are happening that I think this community is going to greatly benefit. I think USGS looking at elevation-derived hydrography is a big deal. That's going to help a great deal. The techniques that Sam talked about in using current technology or LiDAR technology and electro-optical imagery to map impervious surfaces are key. And introducing, you know, analysis like he just showed you that is not just focused on the 100-year floodplain, that is focused on, you know, the three different types of flooding activities that occur, both, you know, fluvial, pluvial, and coastal. That's got to be part of this process. To show you a couple of things, this is the you know, the USGS 3-depth program. Hasn't been around that long, believe it or not. We're about 65% complete doing that now. It's still kind of mind-boggling that it's not, we don't have this over the entire United States. And it's still kind of mind-boggling about the way we kind of go about resourcing this. But it is nearing completion, and it is getting a lot better than it was. Another program that people may not know a lot about is the Joint Airborne LiDAR Bathymetric Technical Center of Excellence, which is under the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and is tucked underneath the Mobile District. It's kind of a partnership between U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Navy Oceanographic Office, NOAA, and USGS to map our coastline with bathymetric LiDAR data. Currently, we're down doing post-Hurricane Sandy data collections along the coast of Mississippi and moving towards, I think, Mexico Beach into Florida. But as we focus on coastal resiliency and the importance of coastal resiliency to the livelihood of our cities and towns that kind of live on the coastline, understanding our coastline is super important. And this little program is tucked underneath USACE Civil Works in kind of a, you know, almost fund if you have extra cash kind of funding line. So things like this kind of beg to have a higher importance. This is just kind of an example. This is bathymetric LiDAR data draped over a traditional map that just kind of shows the contour of the coastline. But post-storm, after every storm we have, it dramatically shifts and changes our coastlines, requiring us to go out and remap it after every storm if we really want to understand coastal impacts and coastal flooding impacts. Thanks. I think that's kind of my time. I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harper. I appreciate it. He's a little modest. He didn't mention with private industry, he helped develop a sensor for collecting a lot of this data to a high degree of resolution, higher than we've ever had in the past, the Buckeye system. And I hope we'll have some good questions for the capabilities that exist that can be used to apply to this problem when we get to the Q&A session. Thanks again, Mike. Next up is Mr. Chad Berginnis. Chad comes to us. He's the executive director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers. In his experience, he has worked as a floodplain manager and a water resource manager at local and state levels. He's also worked in private industry. And so he brings a wealth of experience and perspective to the challenges of floodplain management. He's been the executive director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers since 2012. This 8-year period is probably one of the biggest periods in terms of frequency and scope of flood events in the U.S. history. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chad. Thank you very much for joining us today.
First of all, thank you very much. Are you seeing my screen now?
Yes, we are. I see you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us and participating in this panel. And what I thought I would do in my presentation is I'm going to talk a little bit about innovation and mapping and modeling and provide some commentary there. But then also I want to broaden that to other aspects of the National Flood Insurance Program, because you know, after all, the NFIP is kind of our national framework on how we manage flood risk in the country. By and large, I mean, we have other programs and organizations that do that as well, and it's often portrayed as the four-legged stool with, of course, insurance, mapping, floodplain management, and mitigation. And so I also want to take just a little bit of time and comment on some of those other aspects as well. So just a little bit about Asfpm. We are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing losses in the nation and also recognizing the natural functions inherent in floodplain areas. We actually were founded back in the late 1970s, and we were founded by state floodplain managers that were concerned about federal government policies that were weakening the approaches to floodplain management that some of these states already had in place that were much stronger. And so in the 40 plus years that we've been around since then, we've been doing a lot of different aspects on there. In terms of policy focus, we also develop and maintain the National Certified Floodplain Manager certification, do training and conferences, we develop tools, and we also have a research function through the Asfpm Flood Science Center. So I'm going to start with mapping and modeling, and of course the one picture that we have here is always such a good reminder of the extent of flood hazards that we deal with in terms of Oroville Dam. And my first note would be, we've got to get the job done. One of the things that most folks may not realize is the fact that FEMA, under law, has the requirement to map essentially a lot of pretty much the whole United States, and to map multiple types of flood hazard areas.
Hey, Chad, I don't mean to interrupt.
Yes. Oh, okay. And so essentially, in terms of getting the job done, that includes all flood hazards, and it also includes future conditions. And so the other flood hazards that we really need to pay attention to are things such as inundation areas from failures of dams and levees, urban flooding areas, and future conditions themselves. And in fact, the current inventory that we have of FEMA flood maps is about 1.2 million miles of stream, rivers, and coastlines, and we have about 3.5 million miles of stream, rivers, and coastlines in the country. So we definitely need to make sure that we've gotten the job to do that. And it's not going to be cheap. We actually have produced a cost estimate that is going to be between $4 and $11 billion to provide all of that information and doing that. The second point here is that private insurers really need to be partners in terms of our mapping efforts and supporting those kinds of things. And what I mean by this specifically is that we have, in terms of the National Flood Mapping Program that FEMA is responsible for, one of the...
I don't mean to interrupt you. I don't think we can see your slides.
Oh, okay.
We see you, which is great.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
You just share your screen, yeah.
All right. All right, is that better?
Check.
All right,
Very
perfect. My apologies. I thought I had done that already. But what I mean in terms of private insurers need to be partners is the fact that that as private flood begins to flourish and coexist with the NFIP, You know, an aspect of NFIP policies is the payment of funds through policyholders that helps actually support the National Flood Mapping Program. And this is a legislative area that we've been pretty active in a number of years. And the reality is we face a fight most of the time when trying to get the law changed to include the fact that even on private policies, there should be a contribution to the overall improvement of national flood mapping. And we hope that that dynamic can change. One of the new paradigms that we're going to face in the country, and I think the flood factor tool is really kind of the first of many, is that, you know, the world used to be for floodplain managers, especially at the state and local level, that FEMA data was the only thing that you had. But we are now starting to see other national level data sources. And it's going to be incumbent on all of us to understand and contextualize those data sources. And the reality is, you know, from Sam's presentation earlier, there are data sources that are great for risk communication, educating property owners on the things to like need to buy flood insurance and do all those things. But then there's data sources that are really important from the standpoint of how we regulate buildings and development. And the reality is, you know, FEMA data is at a granularity that allows us to not only competently manage development, but also survive legal challenges when we do those kinds of things. Having been a local floodplain manager, you know, one of the legal strategies that is often used by people that don't like what you're doing to them is to challenge either the regulations or the maps themselves. And so they have got to be a product that is good enough to withstand scrutiny in order to be used for the purposes of floodplain management and mitigation. And then also we need to understand, much better understand the urban flooding issue and be able to map and model it. And again, you know, I'll push gently back a little bit from something my good friend Sam had talked about. And the reality is there is, the statistical approach shows a lot of good promise, but again, I go back to the needs, the broader needs of floodplain management, and from a lot of my members' concerns, a lot of floodplain managers' concerns, we need something with granularity that can say, you know, okay, we're going to regulate to this level. Or if you're a stormwater manager, we need to know exactly what that flood level is so we can design a stormwater system that can actually accommodate that. And so we also need techniques that may be the more expensive hydrologic and hydraulic modeling approach, but again, there are some very significant needs and reasons why we need to have that. Okay, so now I want to go into floodplain management because again, this is an aspect of how we manage flood risk in the country that is very, very important. And we need to have higher and better standards than what we have currently. The NFIP minimum standards have been around and not even updated since the mid-1980s. We've learned a lot in 50 years of the NFIP, and even communities are typically going beyond what those minimum standards are. And so in one area in particular, I think, are subdivision standards. The reality of how development works right now, and this is both a function of the limited mapping that's available as well as the lower standards, is that you have a subdivision that's typically built on an agricultural piece of land, didn't have risk, so it never was really mapped by FEMA. Hundreds of houses get developed there. Nobody knows where that flood risk area is. Nobody's required to model it. And then all of a sudden we have lots of houses and lots of infrastructure built ahead of knowing where the flood risk is. Then only after the fact, because there is risk, do we have risk information being developed. And then all of a sudden the community is mad. Property owners are dumbfounded because all of a sudden FEMA put this floodplain on them. And the reality is the floodplain was always there, but our approach is backwards right now in terms of doing that, which is why, again, we need, I think, a lot of, we need to get the job done mapping the country, first of all. We need to enforce codes better after disasters. we absolutely have got to have future condition. We are investing a lot of both private and public money in infrastructure that's going to last 50 plus years in residential homes. Residential homes have a useful life of typically over 100 years. And yet we are doing this blindly because we don't have future conditions information. And then finally, we're going to need to start asking the questions, are there simply areas we shouldn't be building in? That means stronger zoning codes and things that actually limit uses to begin with in high hazard areas. Flood mitigation is really dealing with the existing built at-risk environment and trying to reduce that risk. So again, in terms of the flood mitigation area, we simply need more money and focus in that. For those of you that are in the flood risk management space, again, our national approach is we spend so much more money in responding to disasters than we do mitigating the flood risk that's there, and we need to flip that dynamic. Future conditions become important in this space as well. So if you're going to mitigate in those areas, we know what that future condition is. We have done a terrible job to date incorporating things like social and environmental justice considerations. Our very strict benefit cost analysis approaches on how we do mitigation don't really incorporate those aspects, and we've got to do a better job. And then finally, we need to deal with the reckoning that's happening, and it's going to happen on our coastlines first. But there are areas that are simply too dangerous to even do in-place mitigation. So we need to do things that some communities don't like to hear about, such as managed retreat from those areas. So again, whether it's in the modeling and mapping space or whether it's more broadly managing flood risk in the country, there's a lot of things I think on the horizon and considerations that we need to be aware of. And hopefully this will spur some thoughts as you manage flood risk yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad, for your excellent remarks and presentation. We appreciate it. Look forward to some good questions for you. And I may have weighted the coin and stacked it in order to get this final panelist to go at the end. Mr. Matthew Eby is the founder and executive director of the First Street Foundation. They are a 501c3 organization that does research and advocacy. And one of the things we hope attendees to this panel will leave the panel with is a sense of their own role in the advocacy for better information, knowledge, understanding, action to address flood threats in the United States, which will only be increasing over the future years. Matthew has worked in the private sector and as well as now in the quasi or nonprofit sector. I'm not sure if it's a quasi nonprofit or a full nonprofit, but I'll let you take over. Matthew, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'll pull up these slides. Everyone can see that. We're good. All right. Appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to what First Street's about, and for having me with all these great panelists. As Sam was saying, as he was talking, it's an honor and privilege to be amongst you other folks in this conversation. So First Street, for a sense of background, is as mentioned, a 501c3 nonprofit. We've been around for about 4 years, and we really focus in on flooding. And what I'll talk about today is our First Street Foundation National Flood Model, which we've released at the end of June and have been working on for the last couple months now. So what we've done at First Street is tried to address a lot of the things that my fellow panelists have been talking about. So we've looked at each one of the major flooding types that go into a general model. So we've reached out, and what we've created as a nonprofit is slightly different than what you would see from the for-profit CAP modeling firms, in the sense that we found that there was a bunch of great academics like Sam and team that are working on individual aspects of flooding that could all be coupled together based on the decades of peer-reviewed research in the field on the individual specifics. So from tidal flooding or pluvial and fluvial flooding or hurricane storm surge. And what we were able to do is kind of convince a whole host of people to come together, bring their expertise, and create one fully coupled model that incorporates all these risks, but also do it in the normal standard that they're used to from the peer review process and open methodology. And what we did with that is something that's a little bit unique and novel in the market, in the sense that we looked at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we took the representative concentration pathway 4 or 5 and created the global ensembles of those climate models to map risk from the model that we had created to the current environment within 2020, and then look at 5-year increments out to 2050 based on that RCP 4.5, as I mentioned, but having uncertainty baked into the model so that we know from the high, mid, and low perspective what we would be looking at within each one of those intervals. So what we're able to do is then say the uncertainty within 4.5 maps relatively closely to the 8.5 curve, or on the low end fits nicely to the 2.6. I should say 2.6, not 2.5. Sorry about that. And within that, what we're able to do is then get the outcomes of not only the current risk, but how it might evolve into the future with our hazard layers. And from there, we then took the parcel data itself, so the polygon, the outline of the property, because as mentioned by a lot of folks on before me, that property level parcel information is so key. But then we overlaid all of that with the building footprint data set. So similarly, it's great to know how at risk the property is itself, but water making it to the building footprint is really the critical calculation that needs to be figured out. And then we map that with our hazard layers themselves, so the probabilities of the very unlikely major flooding event, the 0.2% or the 1 in 500, down to a semi-annual layer. So the very likely every other year flooding event that you would expect, and then ran statistics for each one of those properties to the building footprint. And if there's not a building on the property, we ran it for the centroid of the property parcel, so the center of the piece of land, so that we could have all of those statistics within our database or our API. And what we were able to do then is then compare these results to the FEMA special flood hazard area to understand how this current climate picture would relate to the current special flood hazard area, or the 1% annual flood risk. So we took our median projection and we said, if we have these calculations for all these homes, and we've in our database shown where the special flood hazard areas are, we can then create a comparison to see what the statistics difference might be. And what we found was there's about 14.6 million properties that are in the special flood hazard area based on our model's definition of a 1% or greater chance. And that when you compare that to the current FEMA special flood hazard area, it's about 70% more, or about 5.9 million properties more. And there's some interesting things too, where, and this is not a criticism of FEMA, it's where the mapping methodologies and techniques that they have to do, and the length of time that it takes, they have to take time to update the maps in a different way than using technology like everyone on the call has been talking about. But where we map and show very similar risk is in the coastal areas, where a lot of the maps are very similar, updated more frequently. But our real divergence is where pluvial flooding, or precipitation, which is a standalone risk that we map, is incorporated. And that's where we see a large delta between where we're showing risk and the FEMA maps for today are not showing risk. But what's interesting as well is, because we not only map for the current risk, but then risk adjust into the future based on the emission scenarios, we're able to then have an idea of how risk will evolve. And when you look at that same median projection for the 1% risk for the country, there's a bunch of interesting things that pop out. But one thing is that we see areas of the country that are getting drier, so risk is actually reducing for properties. But more importantly, areas like Florida where risk is evolving substantially. So Florida moves from having a 1 in 5 properties being in that special flood hazard area to actually being 1 in 4, 25% of all properties within the state. Or interesting areas like Louisiana, where we're taking into account all of the adaptation in the state, and it is holding back a lot of flooding as it's meant to do. But as sea levels rise, that adaptation and the defense standard that it's built to, our models show that the water is actually making a pass there and breaching, which then brings risk up for a substantial amount of property. So you see from what we see at risk today to 2050, there's a 70% increase roughly of properties that then fall into that 1% or greater special flood hazard area, or substantial flood risk as we call it. So a lot of interesting things from this large data project that we've done, but the most important thing is that we've launched a tool called Flood Factor, which we'll be talking about at a later panel, which allows you to type in any address for the contiguous United States, and it will give you what our model shows for your flood risk today and how it'll evolve into the future. But we represent that as a score. So it's been really important for us to not only ensure that the best science is being used to create the models and the best inputs, but that we're representing in a way that is very accessible and easy to understand for your average American, because a lot of the stuff is difficult. Probabilities are really hard to understand, especially when you're talking about different factors that go into them, depth of flooding and damage curves and all of these other things. So ensuring that we represent that in something that is easy for your average American to understand and then take action on is critical. So not only what is my risk, but what are the solutions to the problem? What can I do to my property? What can the neighborhood do? What can the city or the state do? And the other thing that we've done is that it's critical to not only create the best science as we can with the best inputs, it's critical to make the best tool possible so that people can understand it when they see it. But if no one knows it exists, then it doesn't really do anything. So we've been fortunate in our partnership with Realtor.com to actually integrate our flood factor scoring and tool into the website itself. So any property that is for sale or not for sale that's looked up on Realtor.com through any of their apps, you'll see flood risk information. And what we've actually been able to do is bring in the FEMA flood zone and information about that zone itself and the risk, which is in our API, along with the flood factor information, so that every American looking at that can then see the risk, not only from the flood factor today and into the future property parcel level information, but know what it means to be in a FEMA zone AE or X or whatever it might be, so that they can make informed decisions. So that's really what we're about, what we've created and the general data that we've released. And all of our methodologies, our reports and data is available for folks to check out at either floodfactor.com or at our foundation website at firststreet.org. So that's it from my perspective.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Appreciate your presentation and the work that you're doing with the foundation. I would have been happy to have you as an ally back in my time fighting for better information and understanding and prediction of the threats while I was in one of those roles. With that, we'll turn it open for questions. I know Beth has been collecting them from a variety of people watching, and Beth, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Duke, and thank you all of our panelists. That was really interesting, and we already have a lot of questions, so you can tell that our audience is really excited and engaged on these topics. I'm going to start with a question for you, Sam, which is, the report-based data analysis is also backward-looking. What are the risks of using this technique when the environment is changing, more rainfall in many areas, more runoff in others, etc.? Can it be adopted to be more forward-looking?
Yeah, so the way machine learning techniques work is that you essentially, the way I describe it, you're training the computers and the models they produce to learn from, say, here's backward time 0 to time 1. So we already know those 2 time points. So we train the computer to predict time 1, which is still in the past. So once we have the backward looking, I guess you could say backward looking or historical observation-based models in place, the computers then were asked to go forward in the future. And that's where we can start to predict future conditions, which we do. We don't say climate change in Texas, we say future conditions. But that includes sea level rise, changes in precipitation. But for me, most importantly, are these subtle changes in the human-built environment. A road, a sound wall. I mean, we have a sound wall in Houston that created $50 million worth of damage, just that one wall. Those are really important aspects. And so once we have these, and as we get this new reconnaissance information via drones and satellites on the changing conditions, and Chad's right, socioeconomic issues are critical as well, and we do a lousy at that. We can embed them in the models and say, ask these questions, what if? So we look backward to train the models. Then we ask those models to learn into the future. That's a non-statistical way of describing it.
Thank you, Sam. Our next question is for Mike. Are there tools in the Army, including but beyond, excuse if I pronounce this acronym wrong, JBALTCX, that can help state and federal entities identify and map their flood hazards with high resolution? Does the Army have the capacity to support governmental or quasi-NGO business if you will providing financing to cover costs and allow Army tech to be applied to the problem? Is this scalable or just not deep enough?
So the Army does have those capabilities still. Their contractor, even though the government owns the sensors, they're still private contractor operated. So the Army does have that capacity. However, the 3DEP program, the USGS 3DEP program, does just that for the nation through a pool of commercial entities that do the same thing and use really the same technology to go after and collect the data.
Thank you. And we have our next question is for Chad. Does the real benefit of H&H models come from anticipating future floods based on a variety of conditions? Checking the model against past floods behavior can verify the model, but how useful is that? H&H modeling can be future looking in ways to assist investment decisions and insurance decisions?
Yes, certainly a benefit of H&H models is for anticipating future conditions, but with one caveat. And that is that we have to have the right data inputs to understand what the future condition is. And this is one of the big deficiencies we have in the nation right now. We have been working to highlight the last couple years the need for a sustained national program on updating our rainfall frequency information, kind of called an Atlas 14 program. And in fact, I'll let everybody know that we finally got some traction just this last 2 months. There is a piece of legislation that was introduced, the Floods Act, Senate S 4462, that would authorize a national Atlas 14 type update program where these data would be updated no longer than every 10 years. And you know what the cost of that is? $3.5 million a year for the nation. Considering all the money we spend everything on this critical data input, we can do it for the entire country for very cheaply. And so, so we need that as a predecessor to make sure our H&H models work well.
Good, great answer.
Thank you, Chad. And Sam, I can see you nodding in agreement. The audience can't see that, but Sam's fervently nodding in agreement. So I thought I'd note that. We have 2 more questions if you guys are willing to stay with us. The first one, which is not directed at anyone, so anyone is welcome to answer and we can have a little conversation. It's a 2-part question. How do we balance or justify the need for more restrictive zoning and the implementation of a more resilient construction stock with the growing housing affordability issues? Will relevant insurance discounts offset some of the affordability stressors?
This is Chad. Let me take an initial stab at this because I think there's a few ways to look at it. Look, as a kind of middle class property owner or homeowner, what's important to me is the monthly cost of ownership, principal, interest, and insurance. And one of the great myths that's out there is that somehow higher standards actually cost people more than lower standards. And we've done some research to show that the monthly cost of ownership is cheaper with a freeboard of 1, 2, or 3 feet in either A zones or V zones than it is to build at the 100-year flood elevation level. And so yes, you could say, well, the total cost to building a home is higher, but the way most people think about it is, how much do I have to pay every month in principal, interest, and insurance?
Thank you, Chad. Does anyone else want to jump in? No. Okay, so we'll move on to the next question, which Matthew, I think, is a really great question for you, and you already answered it a little bit, and it's a little leeway into our next panel. But there's a question that is there a way to research if a property has a flood claim?
So there's a couple different things there. There's flood claims from the National Flood Insurance Program, which FEMA released the claims data at a zip code level. So that would be your best bet at a granularity within that. But one of the things that we've done, because there aren't national disclosure laws around flooding, is used our hydrodynamic models to recreate historical flooding events. So while we can't tell you with 100% accuracy whether a property's flooded in the past or not, we can give you a pretty good confidence rating of whether a historical flood has impacted a property. So on flood factor, when you actually type in an address, if it's been impacted by one of the, I think we're at 100 major historical floods that we've mapped, both inland and coastal. So pluvial events and surge events, that we can tell you it's likely that flood waters made it 2 feet of, or made it to 2 feet of 2 foot of depth to the building footprint from Hurricane Sandy or something like that, and show the actual extent of the inundation area. But from a claims perspective, unless you're in a disclosure state at the time of purchase, there's not really a way to get that, unless my fellow panelists know something that I don't.
I can just add to, he's right. Texas, after Hurricane Harvey, passed a new flood risk real estate disclosure law, which puts it as the most stringent flood risk disclosure regulation in the country, little Texas. And as part of that, property owners who are selling need to disclose whether they have had a claim, whether they're in the 500 year, in a reservoir pool, all this stuff. And so what we're tasked now, because I was the bozo who gets credit or blame for writing it, with creating a kind of a buyer's beware type interface that would be a one-stop shop where a buyer or a seller, they don't have to, go through all this craziness. They can just click on it and it'll tell you. But that's a special circumstance because it's a state thing with FEMA support, and generally you can't, and individual information is very guarded. So there has to be all kinds of security protocols and safeguards. That's a special circumstance, but I think everyone probably knows that that information should be ubiquitous. I mean, it's really important information. My teenage kids, I tell them my little data problems. They're like, just give me half a phone number. I can find your medical records these days. And I think that that the generation that didn't grow up with the ubiquity of data and the ability to get it is, I think, it's maybe controversial, overguarding some information like insurance policies that can be stripped of personal information if we do it right. but you all know that I am a big proponent of using that kind of data. So that's my biased perspective.
Thank you, Sam and Matthew. And we actually have, if you're willing, one more question for you, Sam. Observing flood losses is essential to understand gaps in our knowledge of flood threat and gaps in our protection and mitigation measures. Have your team thought of also analyzing those areas with vulnerability, but which did not or do not flood, and see what best practices enabled their success? Is this possible?
That's a great question. We have a member of our team, Laura Stearns, who's leading a analysis where the question is, she's smarter than me. I've been running around the country saying, let's explain areas that are flood prone and do flood. She comes to me and says, we should be explaining why something should flood but isn't. And so she's leading an analysis, I know, right? She's leading an analysis at a parcel level where we're looking at properties deep in the floodplain that should flood, and their neighbors have flooded, but they haven't, because we can get to that level of granularity. Now she's got data on whether there's a fenced yard, the size of the driveway and the garage, and I mean really micro data. And the purpose of this analysis is to say, maybe there's not a one size fits all situation, and maybe insurance rates should be adjusted in that way, that there are some structures or properties, the position, whatever, all these characteristics that make them less vulnerable to flooding while their neighbors are. And it's not just elevation, there are other features of the structure and the property that we're finding that become critical factors. And so for one time I can answer a question because we're doing it. And if anyone wants to learn more about what she's doing, because she hasn't published yet, and I want to give her all the credit for it, I can link anyone up with her, and she would be delighted to tell you all about her models and her findings.
Thank you, Sam. And that was our last question. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Duke. Do you have any closing remarks?
So I just want to thank our panelists for excellent contributions and for your work that is ongoing in this field. It's a hugely important field to the American public, our society, and our local communities, as well as our national security, in my opinion, and safety. Thank you for your work. I'd be happy if we could, Sam, to receive the notice from you on your colleague who's working on the best practices. The question and the answer remind me of a story from World War II where they were doing analysis of B-17s and B-24s that made it back to base in England, and they showed where all the damage was on the planes. And so they began talking about where they got to armor the planes. This is a very famous schematic in the engineering world. And then they realized, oh, crap, we don't need to armor those spots. We need to armor the other spots, because those are the planes that aren't actually making it back to base, right? And so they figured out and backed into where they needed to armor the planes versus what they initially thought. And so it's great that you're already working on that. That's fabulous, because oftentimes we're very good at identifying gaps as a country and a society, as engineers, and we're lousy at identifying success factors that allow us to apply those best practices to other cases. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I think you have a few administrative announcements, Beth, so I'll turn it back to you, and that concludes our panel.
Yes.
I just posted Laura's email with, I'm sure she wouldn't mind, her Gmail email to everybody. I'm assuming there are not 1,000 people on this session, because she is doing great work. And so rather than, I just posted on the chat so you can email her directly, and CC me if you want. Sorry.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you in advance, Laura. And thank you, Duke, and everyone who came to attend and see this panel. We're really happy to have you here. I'd like to encourage everyone to take some time to go visit our exhibitor booths and learn a little bit more about our sponsors and be put in a raffle to win a pair of AirPods Pro. I'd also like to encourage everyone to come to our next panel, which is a bonus panel with Matthew Evie, who we just heard from, the founder of the First Street Foundation, to learn more about his flood factor tool, which is really making waves in the flood risk management industry, and how consumers understand and perceive flood risk. And so we're all really excited to see that. And I encourage everyone to tune back in at 3 p.m.